biggest secret they still want to keep covered up is the energy. And they don't want other people to know, for example, that all the energy sources that we use now are basically redundant. We don't need to use the energy sources now that we use, that we've been conned into using them. Yeah, all fossil fuels, oil, cars. So you do have to study all of that. You know, I say to people, I've got a collection of videos, for example, about these topics, and it's 7 hours. You've got at least 7 hours to get through, and you've got to maybe watch some of that twice to get it. And there's a lot of other peripheral material to get to grips with this. But you do see that there is this connection to energy, the energy cover-up. I mean, another thing that comes out, for example, if you read Dr. Wood's book and you watch the videos, one of the peculiar things, for example, is some of the effects on people and on cars are levitated. Witnesses report being levitated. David Hampshire, who's a photographer for the New York Daily News, this is one I always talk about when I talk about these topics. He was lifted and carried a block while the tower was coming down. He describes this. We haven't got a video of him like floating through the air, but we have got his testimony that he was lifted up and carried a block. And then another guy was lifted up and thrown against the wall. And we have this Blaise Pasquale, I think. He was on like the 27th floor when the building's coming apart, and he's landed safely. You know, and he didn't recall how this happened. You know, and it's like he was somehow floating down. They called him, there was this urban legend of a 9/11 surfer, somebody who was on the upper floors and somehow survived coming down. He didn't tell his story, I think, until 2010 or 2011. He told it on Fox News because he was really struggled with what happened to him for a number of years. He was, because he was thinking all those people around him died. He thought he was going to die, and it took him years to work out why he hadn't died. And it really, I think that was what he said basically. Mickey Cross, who was a firefighter, he describes coming down the stairs, and he's coming down the stairs, and the building's starting to come apart. And he's having to pull his helmet onto his head because his helmet starts lifting off his head. So what happened on 9/11? Right, well, the towers were there one time, and now they're gone. How did they go away? There must have been mechanisms to go away. And what you're looking at, it's not bombs, it wasn't a laser beam, and it wasn't a microwave beam on its own that it turned things and melted them. It was a technology, and that technology creates certain effects. It creates the appearance of a hot fire, but without heat in certain respects. It can turn metal to powder, but it doesn't affect paper. You know, it can turn porcelain into powder, but it doesn't affect certain other materials. But with this levitation effect, you can call that anti-gravity. So this technology, whatever it is, can create an anti-gravity effect. The way I describe it is, in standard physics, you've got this thing called quantum physics. They call it quantum physics, and when you can go into atoms and look at protons, electrons, and neutrons, but then you divide that down, and you go into like subnucleic particles, and all this, and you end up down at the quantum level where everything goes into the quantum realm, and then they describe this quantum foam. But before all of that came into science in the I think the 50s and 60s, up until before then, up until the 1930s, I think, they were talking about the ether, this underlying kind of substrate of reality. But then they got rid of that idea. When Einstein came in, I think there was an effort, particularly if you look at the way that what they did to Maxwell's equations in physics, they suppressed this idea of the ether. But at the same time, they were investigating what the ether was and how to manipulate it. And what was seen at the World Trade Center, and there's probably a couple of other examples we could mention, was manipulation of the ether, manipulation of the underlying fabric of reality, where our reality interfaces with something else. And you can actually manipulate that thing. You can manipulate the ether. And that's what this technology that destroyed the World Trade Center does. That's why we see effects on matter, we see energy effects, and we see anti-gravity effects. Somebody in the black world knows all about. The towers didn't just, disappear. It was engineered, and it was engineered very accurately. If I was to point out one mistake, they made one mistake, which was the Bankers Trust building. across the road, and that became infected. And apart from that, it was a brilliantly executed, event. The buildings completely disappeared. They created anti-gravity effects. They turned those buildings to dust. They also affected the weather, which is another. Whenever I get an opportunity, I'll try and talk about that.
Is that the one with the Hurricane Erin?
Correct. Because Dr. Wood didn't discover that until 2008. It was February 2008.
Yeah.
And what she was doing, I spoke about this many times, looking at dust. She was looking at the dust. The other unusual thing about the destruction of buildings, one of many, was that the dust kept going up. If you get a standard controlled demolition, you get the bombs going off, the building comes down, and the plume of dust doesn't really go much above the height of the original building. It might get a little bit above, and just settles down. But with the World Trade Center destruction, the dust kept going up, and it went up and up and up. It went into the upper atmosphere. And so Dr. Wood was looking at these satellite pictures to find out, what it was doing in the upper atmosphere, what sort of thing, how it was behaving. And then she found this picture of a hurricane on one of the satellite pictures, which was Hurricane Erin. And that travelled in a straight line for 4 days prior to 9/11, and then made a right-hand turn on the 12th. So as I say to people, there are two scenarios about that. Either it was a coincidence, or it wasn't a coincidence. And if you take into account several things that she then researched, such as it being closest at 8 o'clock in the morning, the storm was at its widest extent, it was moving at its slowest speed, the storm system, during the events of 9/11. I think the barometric pressure and the wind speed in New York City were constant for 16 hours. And the temperature was constant for about 12 hours, I think, something like that. So it's like they'd sort of moved it there and held it there to do something. And nobody talks about this. But apart from, I know 3 people that regularly talk about this: Richard D. Hall, Dr. Judy Wood, and me. Hardly anybody else regularly talks about this. And if they do, they don't mention Dr. Judy Wood's book or my website. But the point is, 9/11, you want to be looking at energy issues, weather issues, and how they've kept this covered up, and how, if whoever's watching this for the first time hasn't heard of this, you've got to first establish whether I'm telling the truth or not, and then if I am telling the truth, why you don't know about it. Think about those two questions.